Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Ruggiero, and I'm a researcher at Mathematica, a social policy research organization based in New Jersey. There is an increasing interest in youth apprenticeship across the U.S. as a way to provide valuable skills and employment opportunities to youth ages 16 to 24. In Mathematica's recent research on state apprenticeship systems, we have seen examples of promising youth apprenticeship initiatives. In honor of Youth Apprenticeship Week, I'll be talking with two state apprenticeship agency staff from Maryland and California to learn more about how their agencies are supporting youth apprenticeship initiatives in their states. We're recording this session today so we can share it with other states and partners who want to learn more about how they can expand youth apprenticeship within their states. Before we jump into our conversation today, I'd like to give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves. Chris, starting with you, can you please share your name, title, agency, and briefly describe your role and your office's role in apprenticeship in your state?
Sure, Ryan, thanks, and thanks for having me today. My name is Chris MacLarion. I'm the director of the Maryland Apprenticeship and Training Program. Our program is located within the Maryland Department of Labor, and specifically within the Division of Workforce Development and Adult Learning. That division, DWDAL for short, is the state apprenticeship agency for Maryland. So one of our key functions, or in the apprenticeship world, almost our sole key function, is to manage the entirety of the registered apprenticeship system on behalf of the U.S. Department of Labor, to whom has approved us as a state apprenticeship agency. And part of that responsibility also goes into our youth apprenticeship system, which has overlap in the registered apprenticeship, but as we'll talk about, throughout the day, is a little bit different. And I'm happy to be here again. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Chris, and thanks for being here. Adele, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Adele Burnes, and I am the Deputy Chief at the Division of Apprenticeship Standards here in California. And we are within the Department of Industrial Relations. And similarly to Maryland, we are the state apprenticeship agency here in California. So we oversee the registration of the 90,000 plus apprentices here in California. And my role in particular as Deputy Chief is I'm really focused on how we expand apprenticeship across a lot of different sectors of California, and how we also think about representation in apprenticeship and making sure we're creating a high quality and equitable apprenticeship system. And a key part of that is developing a whole system of youth apprenticeship. So I'm really excited to be here and celebrating the first ever National Youth Apprenticeship Week and to be having this conversation here.
Great. Thank you so much, Adele, for that introduction and for being with us today. Very excited to have this conversation. So, Chris, maybe we could start with you. If you could tell us a little bit more about the Apprenticeship Maryland program, which is your state's leading youth apprenticeship initiative. We'd love to hear a little bit more. Maybe you could start by telling us, what is it? What is the Apprenticeship Maryland program?
Sure. So the Apprenticeship Maryland program is, just as you started to describe it, it's a program built for youth, for a youth apprenticeship system. It was developed where we first started effectively in 2016 with the 2016-2017 school year as a pilot in the state of Maryland. If you think about it in terms of the registered apprenticeship system and compare it over, youth apprenticeship can be almost viewed as like a minor league system of registered apprenticeship. It was designed that we could bring all the core elements that makes registered apprenticeship so great. Your paid employment, your related instruction, attaching students, high school students, to a meaningful career path to where they would earn and learn while they were still in high school. And then most importantly, or just as importantly, they would receive high school credit for those courses. A couple key differences, of course, is that in Maryland's youth apprenticeship system, it is for high school students. So while we're equally excited to be sharing the National Apprenticeship Week for Youth this week, our youth apprenticeship system is primarily for 16, 17, 18-year-olds, and in particular, juniors and seniors. Just as importantly, youth apprenticeship allowed us the opportunity to work with employers to introduce the apprenticeship concept, to how you could hire a high school student, how you could bring a minor into the workplace. You could train them, educate them, and give them all the components you need for your industry, for your occupation, and then hopefully retain them upon graduation. So it really lets us to break down some stereotypes, right? That students don't want to work, that children today don't want to work, that kids today don't want to work, and eliminate that. And in turn, show the employers just how easy it is to assimilate a minor onto the job. All of that was meant to be done while we also integrate our high schools. So this allows us to introduce the high schools directly to employers and directly to industries. So there can be vetting and matching between high school students that want to begin a career and with employers that want to match up with a student to start that career. And then last, it allows us a great opportunity for just career exploration. If students want to graduate and continue on with another career path, be it going to college, join the military, be a public servant, those options are still available, but it lets our youth apprentices make an educated choice as they approach that graduation cycle.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. And I really like how your analogy of the minor league system here, and for that overview. So, in terms of the pilot, which started in 2016, can you kind of can you say at all how that pilot started, what the motivation was for that pilot, and then where it is today, like how many districts this program is in?
Sure, and you'll hear from Adele. I'm sure a much different comparison. Each state is unique. Each state is different with how we're set up, whether it's in workforce areas, whether it's counties or municipalities, jurisdictions, or in this case, school system. Maryland is a small state, a smaller state, a little bit over 6 million, about 6.15 million residents. But we have 24 unique school systems throughout the state. So each county has its own school system. Baltimore City being counted in that 24. So it's 23 counties in Baltimore City. When we started our pilot, it came out of legislation from 2014 or 2015 to really just figure out, would this work and could it work? There's a lot of studies done, comparisons to the Wisconsin model, the European models, that led us to try this out with what would be called an urban and a rural county. So we chose Washington and Frederick counties in Maryland. They're both towards Western Maryland, but it let us have two counties that were close together, different population sizes and different industry, and launch our pilot. As with most pilots, it started off really small. We had 11 students in that first cohort for 2016 and 2017 with a 100% graduation rate. What the pilot showed us in 2016, at least as we began to kick this off, was that employers were interested. It was not hard to recruit them. But just as importantly, or maybe even more importantly, was that students wanted these opportunities. There was no shortage of students applying for these positions. There was no shortage of schools that were willing to vet the students, help with resumes, and help to make sure that those qualifications matched. So we saw that in 2016 and 2017, the pilot was working great. In 2017 and 18, the second year of it, we saw a little bit of an expansion, right? As you normally do see in a pilot. We went from 11 students to 27, so we almost tripled in size. And we're still with those remaining two counties. Again, the number of employers coming in the program began to grow. And what we found interesting was that in the first school year, we had more employers than students. In the second year, again, we had 44 employers to 27 students. So there's no shortage of employers beginning to come in saying, hey, we're interested in this. We would like to hire somebody that was still in school and begin to integrate them to a career. So we knew we had our building blocks in place. We had support from the legislature and from our administration. We had support from school systems and from employers. So in 2018, we decided to expand this statewide. The legislation had expired. We created policy. And we began to expand out our youth apprenticeship program, making it available to all 24 school systems. It's important to note that this is an additional pathway to the CTE, or the Career and Technical Education graduation pathway for our students. So it really expands the CTE pipeline and the ability for schools to put more students with career-based and industry-recognized credentials. So 2018 and 2019, what we will begin to see is the program will consistently double or nearly double. In 2018, 2019, we rose to almost 50 students. 2019 and 2020, we're up to 74. And as you can imagine, 2020 and 2021, there was a little bit of a hiccup with the COVID year. We only grew to 90 students, but by 2021 and 2022, we were approaching 200. 2022 and 2023, we were approaching 600. And this year, we were just a hair below 1,000 as we approach graduation for the 2023-2024 school year. So every year, we've seen increasing interest both from the school systems, the employers, and the students. And we're really happy to say that as of 2 years ago, we had every single school system in Maryland now participating, and they've had youth apprentices or they currently have youth apprentices in their program.
That's great. Thanks for giving us that overview of the history and to see how the program has expanded. Could you maybe touch on a little bit more about some of the target industries? You mentioned that, in the beginning you had more employers than youth in the program. Maybe kind of thinking about today, what are some of the industries or occupations that youth have the option to take an apprenticeship in?
Yeah, Ryan, that's actually, it's a great question. Going into this, we were really focused on STEM occupations. So, technology, math, science. We really thought that hitting the non-traditional occupations was going to be our key to growth. We also thought we would have reluctance from high-end manufacturing, from construction, from the skilled trades, due to hazardous occupational restrictions. These are minors, job sites can shift. But what we found is that as the program began to grow, all industries came to us. Construction early on, by the second year, was beginning to apply for their companies to have youth apprentices out there, ranging from electricians to carpenters to plumbers to HVAC technicians. So there became a parallel with the registered apprenticeship system, which is heavily dominated by construction and skilled trade. Would that end up duplicating itself in the youth apprenticeship? But as the years went on, we began to see school systems themselves apply to be employers, manufacturers. We've had the bio industry come in and apply, state and county jobs and municipal employers come in, finance, insurance. So what we ended up finding out was that while originally construction looked like it might be one of our biggest, it ended up not being the biggest. And we had quite a few other industries. We've had students that were in the pseudo construction industry where they were doing things like estimating, working in a management function that went through their youth apprenticeship and remained with the company. IT, cyber, and drones, we're seeing an increase in those positions. And as you can imagine, when you're talking to a high school student with the ability to operate a drone, to work the remote control, or to telework, they're very appealing, and those positions fill up pretty fast. Arts, entertainment, and recreations had some opportunities. So what we've ended up having was some 900 employers have applied year to date. We've approved over 700, and we go through the council. We do a formal vetting and approval to make sure that the businesses are that they're proper for the student, they're safe for the student to work in, that they're paying industry wages, a minimum wage to start as a minimum, and that they're meeting all the requirements of a bona fide career path. So of the 900 that have applied, we've approved well over 700, and 500 of those employers have already taken the first youth. So it's a pretty diverse industry and occupational set.
Wow, wow. That's really impressive. Maybe that just before moving on, another question, and we'll be able to talk more about your program later in our conversation too. We have learned a lot about different programs for youth pre-apprenticeship, and your model is youth apprenticeship. Do you maybe just want to briefly say about what that motivation was for youth apprenticeship specifically? And also, could you maybe touch on how is it funded and who are some of the key partners, in addition, of course, to the employer partners that you mentioned?
Our youth apprenticeship program was not built in a silo. It came out of legislation, a lot of support there, of course. And then within the administrations, I should say, is the Maryland Department of Labor. We are one key player within it, but we do this in conjunction with the Maryland State Department of Education, Maryland State Department of Commerce, Juvenile Services is involved. We have 24 school systems, our local education agencies. They're heavily involved. Employers, we have unions, associations. Pretty much as it goes through the state of Maryland, there's not an entity that's not involved or cannot be involved in youth apprenticeship. And that's important to make sure that you're getting the diversity of industries, occupations, but also all the resources available for your students. It's going to be pretty holistic across the board. And you've got to make sure that you're connected to other divisions within agencies. We are talking about minors at work, so other partners could include in our case, Maryland Occupational Safety and Health, making sure that we're checking licenses. So there's a lot of sub partners within youth apprenticeship as you begin to really delve into it. And then I think back to where you started this question was, what was the motivation behind it? So youth apprenticeship preceded me by about a year or two before I got to this position. But when you go back through our annual reports and you look at the studies that were being done, this has really been an ongoing effort in Maryland to grow apprenticeship, period. Now we're talking about youth apprenticeship, but there's a direct connection between youth and registered apprenticeship. And then there's that third leg, which is your pre-apprenticeship side. But to begin to grow registered apprenticeship, to get it out of just being just skilled trades, which have done a phenomenal job for decades and decades and decades, they have built the apprenticeship system that we're managing today. But also, how do we begin to traverse that over from just the skilled trades to IT, to cyber, to healthcare, to pathways that we know can easily adapt to registered apprenticeship? And sometimes it is involved with getting younger. So in Maryland, one of the ideas was, let's bring it all the way back to high school. Let's begin to reduce the age of people that are entering apprentices, start those career path earlier, reduce college debt where possible, increase their earnings immediately upon graduating from high school, but also introduce apprenticeship to more industries. And the more that we can introduce this across the board to industries that don't think apprenticeship is for them, the quicker that we can also grow the registered apprenticeship outlet. So this was meant to be a wholesale restructuring of our apprenticeship system throughout the state, and I would say that's really the primary motivation. I did leave out, Ryan, you mentioned funding. So that is important. When the pilot started, it was just a couple of very small grants. I think it was $20,000 total. So this was heavily paid for by employers. As it has gone on, we have gotten increased amounts of funding, and it would be important to note that Maryland's blueprint for the future has ambitious requirements for us. By the year 2030, 2031, we're required to have 45% of our high school students will be graduating high school having completed the first year of our apprenticeship program, also called the high school level of an apprenticeship program, or an industry recognized credential. So that's some 29,000 students a year that will be going through this system. So when we go all the way back to the pilot, into funding and how it was built, it's all slowly morphed itself into the blueprint, at least in Maryland's case, and the goals that come with it. And since then, the blueprint comes with funding that goes to the local school systems to how they can pay for career education classes, how we can pay for certifications, industry recognized credentials. There's funding for state staff to increase the size of our program. But the employers still largely pick up most, if not all, of the cost of wages, unless there's a grant or something else available. And then the education will come through the system itself.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. Funding is always important. So it's good just to get an overview of how you funded that program, and also really impressive to see it starting out with a $20,000 grant and how much it has expanded. Thank you for sharing that. Go ahead,
Can
Adele.
I ask one question?
Yeah.
I'm curious if Chris, if you could speak to for just a moment about like the differential definitions of a high school apprenticeship versus a pre-apprenticeship versus an apprenticeship in Maryland. Like how, when you're talking to an employer, like how are you differentiating between these different models?
Sure, and Adele, it's a great question. And I think for all of us in the system, whether we're Mathematica staff out there talking to an employer, whether it's California talking to an employer, Maryland, to an Office of Apprenticeship State talking, a third-party intermediary, there's a lot of conversations going on, and it is important that we're able to quickly morph in and out of the definitions, but in a way that doesn't confuse the businesses. The last thing we need is complexities that make the system look more onerous than it really is, or that undersells the importance and the value of what we're building as we go through this. So Youth Apprenticeship in Maryland is standalone, where you have the junior and senior year, they're in their high school program, and they're not a bona fide registered apprentice. So that was our minor league system, if you will. Our registered apprenticeship system is the one that we all mostly work in, and that's we're registered in the state of Maryland, approved by the United States Department of Labor. It's your time, competency, and hybrid-based occupations that can last 1 to 5 years, and it covers every range of occupations really that you can imagine, as long as you can combine paid work and 144 hours a year of school. So we have a registered apprenticeship system on that side. In Maryland, it's almost solely made up of 18-year-olds through an unlimited end age. Now, in terms of the actual age breakout, in Maryland right now, 52% of our apprentices are between the ages of 16 and 22 years old. So it's a pretty good number. And that goes back to Ryan's earlier question, like, what was one of your motivations for creating this? It was to begin to lower the age down. We know that the average age of an apprentice nationwide is right around 30 years old. In Maryland, the average age of graduation in 2017 was about 30, so we were starting at 25 or 26. So right now, we're about 52% of our apprentices are 22 years or younger. So that's a positive. I would also say, when we're talking about these definitions, that there is overlap, though. I don't know how in the weeds we get on something like this, but in 1993 or 1994, the federal government had federal legislation for school to work programs. And one of those school to work programs was school to apprenticeship. So in Maryland, we do have a carve out of students that begin their formal registered apprenticeship while they're still in high school. Now, the number may not sound overly impressive when I say there's 103 of those students today, but historically, we've never had more than 5, 6, 10 at a time. So we have about 100, a little over 100 students that while in high school, they're formally going through their 3, 4, 5-year registered apprenticeship program. Last year, we graduated about a dozen of those as electricians. This year, we're graduating about another dozen. So we're seeing a slow uptick in that. And that's an important distinction, because as we begin to work on the blueprint and implementing those goals, we are going to need to have more formal registered apprentices that are starting in high school, which means expansion of your apprenticeship system holistically. So we may see the youth apprenticeship piece that we talked about earlier slowly shrink as the formal registered apprenticeship process grows within the school system. And then last, pre-apprenticeship, we do adhere to USDOL's definition of what is a quality pre-apprenticeship. And that can be pretty simple to work with in Maryland. We do not register our pre-apprenticeship programs. A sponsor is able to build one themselves. If they are going to use our funding or federal funding that flows through the state of Maryland, we do ensure that they meet the minimum guidelines that are within the federal guidance. And that includes directly connecting a graduate of a pre-apprenticeship to a formal registered apprenticeship program, allowing for credit for somebody that completes a pre-apprenticeship to go right into the registered apprenticeship program. And with our youth apprenticeship system, there is no requirement for pre-apprenticeship at all. So there's not much that we have to do in terms of that explanation. But I will add a little bit of a selfish note. I'm much more fond of youth apprenticeship because the students are paid, they're working, they're progressing through a career, they're getting that education. And that really does check a lot of those boxes of the pre-apprenticeship program. Whereas a formal pre-apprenticeship program, they're very rarely paid. There might be a stipend that the apprentice gets to offset some cost while they're going through the program. But so I'll close with that, Adele, and I hope that helped.
Yes, thank you so much, Chris. And I have some follow-up questions, but why don't we turn it to Adele and then we can kind of bring it back to both of you for some follow-up. So Adele, would love to hear from you specifically more about California's Opportunity Youth Grant, and maybe you want to kind of give a little bit overview about, youth initiatives generally in California as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I so appreciate hearing from Chris and Maryland and all that you're doing. We're continually learning from each other as we iterate on this. And I will say that Chris, you were mentioning your blueprint. We have a similar type thing that we're working towards here in California. About 2 years ago, we published a 5-point plan to advance apprenticeship in California, which had, different focus areas, but one of those 5 points was to develop a system of youth apprenticeship here in California, both for in-school youth and out-of-school youth. And there's been a few different key areas of that. There was an investment into that strategy. So that is what has led to the California Opportunity Youth Apprenticeship Grant. We call it the COYA grant for short. So I'll definitely tell you more about that. And but it also led to the creation of the California Youth Apprenticeship Committee, which is a group of about 18 folks that we identified across the state that represent employers, educators, unions, program sponsors, and a variety of workforce partners and community-based organizations with experience serving youth. And we've brought this group together and really tasked the group with arriving at a set of recommendations that's actually due in June of this year. So we've been working on this for 2 years, and or really sort of a year and a half. And I'm excited to be arriving soon at a place of recommendations. And specifically, we tasked that group with developing recommendations around definitions of youth apprenticeship, which I think are most relevant to that in-school youth category, which is why I was asking Chris about that, because I'm forever collecting notes as to how other folks are doing this. And of course, the Youth Apprenticeship Committee, we also wanted to get input from them on the most effective use of the funding. So we did a whole public comment process around developing the COYA grants that started and centered with that committee. And then we're also looking for recommendations around how we as a state structure ourselves around youth apprenticeship. And so what we found as we dove into that work is that there really is kind of 2 different categories of the work. So we have an in-school working group and we have an out-of-school working group within that youth apprenticeship committee. And I'll name that the funding in particular, the COYA grant, is really focused on opportunity youth. It's right there in the name, the California Opportunity Youth Apprenticeship Grant. And it's really focused on trying to get opportunity youth into apprenticeship pathways, both through pre-apprenticeship and also the development of apprenticeship programs. And so how we have rolled out that funding is that we have, We've received about $40 million total towards this overall effort of youth apprenticeship here in California. And so we're putting a significant portion of that towards this COYA grant. And we have 4 different categories of the grant. So there's a planning grant for both pre-apprenticeship planning and apprenticeship planning grants. And then we have implementation grants for both pre-apprenticeship implementation and apprenticeship implementation. And the grant amount ranges from $300K to $2 million, and sort of dependent on the category and the number of proposed participants served by that particular grant. And it has a focus on community-based organizations that have experience serving opportunity youth. And opportunity youth are those who are age 16 to 24 who are either already disconnected from our education system or at risk of disconnection from our education system. So those facing major barriers to employment, such as being foster youth, people who are youth parents, people with disabilities living in high poverty areas. So it's really thinking about how can we create on-ramps for these opportunity youth into employment. And we recognize that 2 of the key components of that are paid training opportunities. Much to Chris's point, pre-apprenticeship, through this grant, we're offering the opportunity for the funding to be utilized towards educational stipends while somebody is in a pre-apprenticeship, because we recognize that opportunity youth can't not be earning often. And we want to be seeing folks get into an apprenticeship as quickly as possible, because that's where there is that earn and learn, right? So, and we also heard a lot about the importance of supportive services. So we want to not just get opportunity youth into apprenticeship, but help them be successful and complete. And we know that there's a lot of life barriers or life challenges that come up. And so those supportive services to those opportunity youth going through apprenticeship programs are so critical. So those are some of the sort of general outline of the funding. And the particular sector focus for this funding is the expansion areas of apprenticeship. So outside of the building trades, so in sectors such as healthcare, education, the fire trades, advanced manufacturing, tech. So those are kind of the industry focus areas of the COYA grant. And so we have opened up the first round of that grant, and we're in the final phases of awarding and contracting. So I don't have the announcement yet to share here, but we are very soon to be announcing that first round of COYA grantees. And I will say we were just overwhelmed with the level of response that we got, which really told us that there's a need for this funding, and there's a lot of very interested partners, both community-based organizations, workforce boards, like Title I schools. So we're excited about this work ahead, and also, of course, excited about the report that this Youth Apprenticeship Committee is putting together towards definitions, which I think are going to play a really key role in the in-school end of the spectrum piece of things.
Thanks so much, Adele. That's really interesting. And, it's great to hear that this COYA grant has been rolled out. It'll be exciting to see, what happens once these grants are awarded. I'm wondering, with this approach of having these grants for community organizations, was it a requirement for the community organizations to have experience with apprenticeship? And if not, is there support that's being offered to those organizations? I know we often hear that the apprenticeship system can be complex and there's paperwork, and just curious if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, no, experience in apprenticeship was not a requirement for these organizations. The required experience was, do you have experience supporting opportunity youth to get into employment? That was really the expertise that we were looking for. And what we're hoping to achieve through this grant is that we're helping these organizations that are out there, whether they be nonprofits or workforce boards or other entities that have experience serving these populations. How can we help transition their effective practices into the apprenticeship world to make sure that we're building those bridges for those populations that they have experience serving into our overall apprenticeship system. And so that was really the key thing that we were looking for. And we also had quite a lot of like flexibility in the funding mechanism to say that, okay, we accepted proposals for like to create a new apprenticeship program that had a focus on opportunity youth, but we also accepted proposals from community-based organizations that were working in partnership with an existing apprenticeship program where there could potentially be an MOU developed between the two organizations, where the community-based organization was helping to like source and create awareness of the apprenticeship opportunity among those that they serve, and providing supportive services to those apprentices. And then so that that population could be getting into that apprenticeship program and then be supported through the apprenticeship. So that was, that's really the core intent of the funding, is to try to help these organizations get into the apprenticeship space. And part of the funding that has come our way at DAS is to hire a team. So we are in the process of hiring a youth apprenticeship team here at DAS. I think I have my schedule next week packed with interviews. So we're getting very close to actually hiring some folks into the DAS team. And so there'll be a team of 5 or 6 people that are really exclusively focused on pre-apprenticeship and youth apprenticeship, because we recognize we want to be providing support and technical assistance to all of these programs that are emerging, whether they get the grant funding or not. We want to be supporting all of these folks in developing these on-ramps into apprenticeship.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for providing that overview with the partnerships. I think that information is really helpful. I just have one more quick follow-up, and then I'd like to move on to kind of highlight some successes. You mentioned the funding earlier. Could you just clarify, where is that funding coming from? Is it state funding for the COYA?
Yes, this is California state general funds have funded this effort to date.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So interesting. I really appreciate you sharing, both of you sharing more about your programs. So now that we know a little bit more about your youth initiatives, I'd like to talk briefly about some successes implementing these initiatives. And I know COYA is still in its early stages, but maybe there are some successes you could share. So let's just start with successes. Would love to hear from both of you of how youth have benefited from each of your initiatives, or maybe in California's case, how you think youth will benefit. I know you both mentioned that it's important for you to get paid. It may seem obvious, but I would love to hear more about like, why is that important, and why is that important specifically for the youth populations who are taking advantage of these youth initiatives, the high school youth that you mentioned, Chris, and out of school youth. So either of you want to jump in and just talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, I'm happy to start us off. I will say I think it's just there's a lot of people who can't afford to not be earning. I think that's just a reality, and I think a lot about the sort of average high school outcome data is that 1/3 of high school graduates go on to a 4-year degree, 1/3 go on to a 2-year degree, and 1/3 go on to no further higher education. And I think that that 1/3 that doesn't continue on to any higher education, I think in a lot of cases, those are folks who have to be earning. They don't have the option to not earn and go to school full time, let alone be able to pay for school. And so I think a lot about those folks and how they're hardworking and determined and probably like pretty creative and resourceful, and how can we be creating on-ramps for those folks into family sustaining wage careers. So that's certainly one of the things that really motivates me in this work, and I want to make sure that as we're really developing a big system of apprenticeship across a lot of different sectors, that we're making sure that we're creating those equitable on-ramps into these opportunities to be earning and learning. And many apprenticeships here in California are associated with our college system, so our community college system or our system of higher education. And so I think that it's an incredible opportunity. I mean, for example, in our community college system, if an apprentice is enrolled in community college classes associated with their apprenticeship, there's no tuition fees for those classes. So it's just a tremendous opportunity to be earning and learning and upskilling into a career. So I think that's certainly a guiding North Star for us here in California. And in terms of successes, and we certainly are earlier on this journey and this pathway, but we've had just incredible levels of engagement with the California Opportunity Youth Apprenticeship Grant. We had a tremendous amount of public comment a year ago when we opened that up. We had over 52 different written pieces of public comment and almost 100 people attending a public committee meeting to give public comment. So just incredible engagement there. And then when we got to our deadline for the first round of funding, we had 192 proposals, which just vastly exceeded our expectations in terms of the number of entities that were interested in this grant and thereby interested in creating these on-ramps into apprenticeship. And so that has just been tremendous. And we're really excited for we're very soon to announce the $31 million worth of funding that we are going to be administering in this first round of the grants. So it is certainly early stages, but that is some early success metrics just in terms of the level of engagement. But we're hoping to be serving about 2,000 participants through this COIA grant. So we're hopeful how that can be really seeding a system. And earlier, Chris was talking about the percent of youth apprentices in Maryland, and I certainly applaud the percent there. I looked at our most recent database. We have a Tableau dashboard that is available publicly, so anyone can go look up these stats at any point in California. But right now, of the roughly 90,000 apprentices in California, about 28,000 are between the ages of 16 and 24, which works out to be about 32% of active apprentices in California today are between the ages of 16 and 24, and the average age of an apprentice here is 29. So I know that that's roughly on par with the national average, but I think it's noteworthy to compare that with Maryland, which rolled out this system of sort of a high school entry point into apprenticeship, and they're at 50% youth apprentices, which I think is incredibly exciting and noteworthy. And so we're certainly hopeful for how some of these investments here in California will help to move the needle on that, because I certainly think about, like, wow, if the average age of an apprentice is 29, somebody is taking a long time in their life to find this pathway, this earn and learn pathway into a career.
Right.
It would be so amazing if we can be having folks younger finding this pathway into these really, career paths that offer potentially family sustaining wages. So we're very motivated to be bringing down that average age and increasing that percentage of youth apprentices here in California.
Yeah, all great points on the importance of earning while you learn, and also great to kind of see, your reach with youth apprentices in the state. Just as a follow-up, do you have any lessons learned or recommendations for other states who maybe want to, have a similar grant program? I know California is a very large state, but maybe if they want to model it in a similar way on a smaller scale. And one point in particular, if you could touch on, with the high number of applicants for community-based organizations to complete those applications, that's no small feat. So I'm curious if there's a recommendation too around on maybe the ease of the application process as well to encourage some of these community-based organizations to apply.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say there were a few key things that we heard in the public comment process that really informed how we structured this grant. One was that just how incredibly important supportive services are to getting opportunity youth into apprenticeship. And we actually asked the question of, like, what supportive services should we be sure to fund, so that when we made that list of allowable use of funds, we were as broad as possible you know, from legal services to transportation to childcare to, you know, equipment costs, books. So like some of the obvious ones, but also some of the less obvious ones, right? Like emergency housing stipend or, you know, different, so really getting creative about making sure that your list of allowable expenses includes as broad a set of supportive services as you can. I will say that another big thing that we heard that is often, I think, challenging about public funding sources is that often public funding sources are entirely a reimbursement model, which is incredibly difficult for community-based organizations to find or have the capital essentially to run these programs and then only later get reimbursed. And we know that the contracting and invoicing and payment process is never going to be a quick and efficient process. So when you add the reimbursement mechanism to that, it's really tricky. Now, we had to kind of square that with the realities of accountability of public funding. You can't just like gift funds to people for no activities. So the midpoint that we found was that what we're doing is that with the first quarter's report, we're awarding 25% of the total funds, which is way more than they would have spent in the first quarter, but they've done something. So it's not considered like a gift of funds, but it's giving them sort of like that initial amount of what I would call like working capital to function with, right? And then from there on in the grant, it's a reimbursement model, but like they don't need to have demonstrated but basically the last 25% of reimbursed costs won't be reimbursed because it was given at the front. But that was, so we're still in the early phases, but I can say that that was at least an attractive enough mechanism that a lot of folks came to the table and were like, oh, we can work with this, right? They weren't sort of scared away from the get-go of like, oh, this is going to be too difficult and cumbersome. We did try to make the application process simple. I mean, we still had to get like narrative and budget and all these like core and participant plans and these kind of things. So, but perhaps the structure and the way we communicated it and the process to apply was also not so cumbersome that people felt like it was a barrier. So the final thing I will say is that we did a lot of communication about it. I announced the framework of the funding at National Apprenticeship Week in November, and we didn't actually release the solicitation until February, and then it was open through March. And so I think having that long communication window also made a big difference in just getting the word out there, so that because partners need to get organized, right, to like put together the coalitions. So those are a few different areas, and I would just say that some of those are general grant management, some of those are specific to serving opportunity youth, but we also have like sort of separate funding through our community college system that's called the California Apprenticeship Initiative grants. And I think those are amazing grants also for the in-school, high school youth apprenticeship programs that we're also seeing emerging in this moment. So yeah. Well,
That's great. Thank you so much. So Chris, just turning it back to you, in terms of successes for the AMP program, one of the things I wanted to ask was, could you say more about how you were able to get so many employers on board? You know, you kind of touched on this earlier, but we often hear that a challenge to getting employers involved in youth apprenticeship might be that they are a little bit hesitant to hire youth, and you know, you all have had such success. So if you could share any strategies or any tips that have worked well to get employers on board for youth apprenticeship, that would be great.
Yeah, Ryan, and absolutely, and what you said is true. There are a lot of true and false, theories and thoughts and philosophies out there among employers. Can they hire a youth? Is it hard to hire a youth? And the reality is most of them are pretty easily answered. It's no, it's not difficult to hire a youth. No, there's not much of a difference, right? The hours can be a little bit different. They do have school, but there are flexible schedules within the school system where they can maybe work every other day. They can work evenings, half days. It depends on the student's schedule. But more importantly is some of the misconceptions are out there, like it's illegal to hire a youth, which it's not. It's hard to navigate around certain requirements, which it's not. So what's important is that when you begin to create it, that we have to remember we're all going to learn something as we go through this. There's a lot of industries, a lot of occupations, a lot of scenarios. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing coming to an employer is they know how to hire people. They know what the rules and laws are around their industries. And it's really not much different when hiring a minor. And being able to traverse that and explain that to the employer, and then have them tell you in a real scenario of how they operate their business. How do they onboard an employee? And what would the difference be when onboarding a minor? And then second is in Maryland, we do have guidance out that, we were very fortunate to get that there is no difference in the insurance rates. By bringing in a 16-year-old or a 25-year-old, there is no difference with employer's insurance. It doesn't affect their compensation premiums differently. So being able to assure them of that and then having something to back that up is key. And then last is, this really is, I was listening to some of the things that Adele said when I was able to log back in. This really does have to be a system-wide approach. When we started this, the apprenticeship program in Maryland had about 3.5 staff to cover the entire state. In 2017, we were able to use a federal grant to add a few more staff. As soon as you begin to insert people that begin to be able to go out to the county, to talk to your chambers, talk to local businesses, talk to associations, you begin to get these applications that come in. We're very fortunate that this administration, Governor Moore and our secretary, have really advocated for apprenticeship or opened up career pathways, removing inequities, just expanding just the skilled training that so many people need. And really to be an economic solution for our businesses is that we now have about 25 staff spread out across the state. And we're seeing an immediate increase, again, in the number of employer applications we're getting. And that's doubled down with our local workforce areas. This is really systematic. They are out there doing the same thing we're doing. They're talking to their employers, that, not just to the job seekers. They're talking to employers about, are you aware of apprenticeship, youth apprenticeship, registered apprenticeship? They begin to bring in more. Your local chambers are doing the same thing. The local school systems, believe it or not, they have counselors that do nothing but work with students that are going to work. They're meeting businesses, referring them over. So it does get to a point where it's a wholesale philosophy that everybody's out there doing the same thing. And what we're seeing now is we get on average 1 to 1.5 applications from an employer every single day. So wow. We envision you quickly surpassing 1,000 employers and then moving on from there. But a lot of it is messaging. And then there were bus ads. We do have ads running the local motor vehicle administrations. We do have videos that we put out. So there's just more traditional outreach as well. But a lot of it comes down to just human capital and people that are out there pounding the pavement, meeting with businesses.
Thanks for sharing that. And do you also think that there's kind of a momentum that happens too, that kind of like getting some of those initial employers on board and then others seeing the success, it helps to inspire other employers to maybe want to join?
Absolutely. While I wish that was a data point that we had, I know from talking to employers that a fair percentage come from another employer saying, hey, I have hired a youth apprentice, it worked, or I hired this individual in 2018, they're still here. So we do get employer to employer engagement referrals. And then every time that we can do an event or we have an outreach or we have a week like this where we're able to highlight a youth apprentice or a registered apprentice. There was a youth apprentice trailblazer. He's also registered in Maryland yesterday, did a USDOL event in a panel. He just did a fantastic job. And this young man is in high school. He's just absolutely destroying perceptions about students that can work and not work. And this young man's well on his way to being a licensed electrician. So, yeah, success does build success, absolutely.
That's great. And also with this week, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for youth apprentices to lift up their own voices, right? To bring attention to the great work that they're doing. And as this for youth apprenticeship as a career path. Something I just want to follow up on is how important do you think the counselors are in the schools with this, right? So thinking about, youth at age, 16, 18, juniors, seniors in high school, how key is the counselor in working with that student to make sure that they're really ready for the apprenticeship and maybe also helping them troubleshoot, challenges that might come up along the way?
It's essential. Schools are first of all, just a student being in school, we all know the formulas, right? They're there for about a third of their day, give or take. They spend more time with their teachers and counselors than they do with their parents. They are in that school system a lot, and it's important that the school has the resources both to administer the program and to give the students, the apprentices, if you will, the time that they need and the vetting and help that they need to make sure they're a good match. There's probably nothing worse than making a bad match to a student that does not want to be in a position or is not suited for a position, because not only do we do disservice to the student, to the apprentice, but also the employer who may not come back after that. So we are very fortunate in Maryland. Every one of our school systems has what's called an Apprenticeship Maryland Program Coordinator, and they coordinate for their local school system all the activities around youth and apprenticeship. Some schools have significantly more, and they have school counselors that do just this. They're career and guidance counselors that are working with the students on way more than just the college connection, right? They're talking about employer connections, career connections, registered apprenticeship connections, and whatever else can be available to a student. But those counselors are key, and they have to know as much as the youth apprentice. They need to know the system as well, because they're going to be the ones making the match, and they have to understand the requirements, whether it's, you want to go into movie editing, you want to go into being a forest ranger, or you want to be an electrician. They all have really unique requirements to get in, but as well as to graduate from a program. So they're going to be a key element in Maryland for decades to come as we build this out.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Chris. This has been so informative, and it's clear that you're passionate about this topic. Is there anything you want to say on why you think youth apprenticeship is a really important option for youth, or any recommendations that you'd want to give to another state who maybe is thinking about growing their youth apprenticeship program?
Yeah, and Ryan, I mean, this is not hard to believe in. We live in a time where college has been an option, and it's a great option for some, maybe for many. But we have to be aware that that option is not always equal, that there are people that go into the option, maybe not fully educated on what the consequences of going to college could be. You may not need a college education, or you only may need some of a college education, but you certainly have to know what's going to come with upon graduation with student debt and loans that very well might be there for years, if not decades to come. But to be able to connect somebody that doesn't know that there's a pathway into any kind of an industry, any kind of an occupation, to where they could begin at 16 or 17 years old. By 19 or 20, they're making journey worker wages. They're making industry leading wages. You're talking about seeing students, apprentices, young individuals, really, that could be 19, 20, and 21, that have already have 2, 3, 4 years of career earnings behind them. They're buying their homes, their cars. And I think that for me personally, and I think for at least for all of our staff, when you start to look at the age of a college graduate, which tends to be around 24, we have apprentices that have been fully graduated since they were 20 and 21. That means they've had 5 or 6 years of career earnings before their peers are graduating college. And this is a debt-free option for them. So I think that, the sooner that we're able to help them make that connection and have meaningful work, they're beginning to invest in themselves, their future, their 401ks, and at the end of the day, again, without that debt. So making sure that all these options are truly equitable and open to all. So we have a parallel pathway to military service, public service, and to college education is going to be key to have a truly equitable system.
All right, thank you so much. So Adele, can you maybe just briefly share how your agency collects youth apprenticeship data, and if there's been any successes around the collection of that data or even the use of that data?
Yeah, absolutely. So in California, we have what we call the California Apprenticeship System, which is our database for how all apprentices are registered here in California. It's built on an Oracle database. So that is the background system for tracking apprenticeship data and actually pre-apprentices. We do register pre-apprentices as well here in California. So we're tracking both of those in that database. And then we actually have a Snowflake data lake with a Tableau dashboard that we use in order to have the public facing dashboard that many of you probably interact with and have seen. Here in California, if you go to the DAS website and you go to apprenticeship data, it'll take you to this Tableau dashboard where you can see the breakdown of apprentices and pre-apprentices, and you can see it by region, by sector, by occupation, and by age. And so we do track that. And I was just sharing about the breakdown of youth apprenticeship here in California, and that right now 32% of active apprentices today in California are between the ages of 16 and 24. So that is a metric that we are continually tracking, and that we have that publicly available dashboard.
Well, Adele, thank you so much for your time today. I know you're busy. It was great to learn more about California's youth apprenticeship initiatives and about the COYA grant, and I'm excited to share this with other states. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Chris, did you want to say anything about your data systems or, any challenges or successes around tracking youth data that you'd like to share?
So our data system, has been us compiling everything into sheets. When you start a brand new program, you often don't have a true data system with it. Schools have their own data system, how they track their students, their grades, their attendance, things like that, which they do a fantastic job of. But as far as we were for the youth apprentices, we've been tracking them and all of the information goes with it in a set of Google Sheets. So it's a little bit of a tedious process. It does become unwieldy as you begin 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 apprentices. But somewhere around this summer, we'll be transitioning into the new data system itself, a proper data system, which will allow us to compile everything, track everything. So it just took a little bit of system growth to get there to necessitate that need. So if we were to revisit this in September, October, hopefully I'll be able to report exactly what the system looks like and what kind of data we're pulling out of it, because it's going to be important to have.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to talk to us today and sharing your valuable insights on Maryland's Youth Apprenticeship Program. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having us, and you have a great apprenticeship week.
You too, Chris. Thanks so much. In closing, I'd like to thank our panelists, Chris and Adele, for taking time out of their busy schedules today to share information about the youth apprenticeship initiatives in Maryland and California. We learned so much about your programs today and are inspired by the work you are doing to improve employment outcomes for youth across your states. Thank you and happy Youth Apprenticeship Week.